Strange but true stories. Tales from the light side, the dark side, and the other side. I'm Steve White. Stephen Hawking, if he were still alive, would have turned 80 recently, and the reminder of his birthday caused me to think again about his take on what if aliens visited Earth and decided to make contact with humans. He said, if aliens ever visit us, I think the outcome would be much as when Christopher Columbus first landed in America, which didn't turn out very well for the Native Americans. And then that got me thinking more about aliens and alien abduction stories, and I came across today's first story. Now, this is not a pretty story, and it did not end well for one human. Seriously, this story is a bit gruesome, with some pretty horrid details. If that's not something you're into, then maybe you could skip this one or skip ahead to story number 2. But if you stick around, just remember, you have been warned. March 1956, at the New Mexico Joint Guided Missile Test Range near Las Cruces, New Mexico. One of the most bizarre and grisly stories of alien abduction is said to have taken place. One late evening in March, Air Force Major William Cunningham and Sergeant Jonathan Lovett were busy recovering scattered debris from a recent rocket test. This particular test range had already had a significant history as a proving ground. The first atomic bomb, codenamed Trinity, was detonated here on July 16, 1945. After World War II, captured German V-2 rockets were test-fired on this ground until 1951. But on this night, 5 years later, the pieces of the rocket the two men were gathering would serve as a mere backdrop to the dramatic events that were about to unfold. Cunningham and Lovett drove out into the desert. The sun had long drifted below the horizon and the stars had popped out. A full moon wouldn't happen for another few days, but it was bright enough to provide the illumination they needed. They didn't need to pick up every little piece of the scattered rocket, just the big pieces. They stopped in the general area they knew the rocket came down, hopped out of their Jeep, and went in different directions with their flashlights scanning the area. Cunningham had a bead on a large fragment and was just about to pick it up when he heard Lovett scream. It wasn't a, "Hey, come here," scream. It was a scream of his buddy being attacked by something. Cunningham thought maybe it was a snake. The Mojave rattlesnake was pretty common in this area, and their bite could be painful and was extremely venomous. Still is. If it was a rattlesnake bite, Cunningham would have to rush his partner back to the base quickly to save his life. Running in the direction of Lovett's screams, Cunningham crested a small hill and watched in horror as his friend was not nursing a serpent bite, but instead was being dragged by a long serpentine arm wrapped around his legs. This arm emerged from a silver disc-like craft that was hovering a few feet off the ground about 20 feet away. Cunningham froze in horror, wanting to help Lovett, but not knowing how. As the sergeant continued his shrill shrieking, the alien arm pulled Lovett into the craft and flew swiftly away from the site. Cunningham raced back to the Jeep and radioed the base that he needed help quickly. Something had happened to Lovett. Something had happened to Lovett. Something that he couldn't quite explain without venturing into the absurd. Armed soldiers arrived a few minutes later and poured out of vehicles in a frantic search for Lovett. Cunningham told the story as best as he could, but he was soon taken back to the base for observation and treatment after officers heard his bizarre retelling of the series of events. In Frank Joseph's 2018 book, Military Encounters with Extraterrestrials, The Real War of the World, base personnel noted an unidentified radar contact near the area around the time of the Lovett incident. Hours of searching turned into days. Search parties were dispersed in different directions over the course of 3 days looking for Lovett, keeping hope alive that it would be a rescue and not a recovery mission. Unfortunately, the lifeless, naked body of Jonathan Lovett was finally discovered a little more than 10 miles from the site of the abduction. It was estimated the body had been exposed to the elements between 24 and 48 hours. Now, this is where the grisly details discovered during the autopsy need to be pointed out to draw a difference between a dead body exposed to wildlife and one that had apparently been subject to surgical mutilation. The officer's tongue had been cut from the lower portion of the jaw. His eyes and anus had been excised with precision, suggesting sharp instruments and a certain expertise. In addition, the body had been completely drained of blood. However, the coroner noted there was no vascular collapse that is associated with life-ending loss of blood. The death of Jonathan Lovett was investigated by the Air Force. The final report was apparently written up under Project Grudge Report 13. Now, Project Grudge was a precursor to Project Blue Book. The timeline here doesn't completely match up, and I couldn't find an explanation for the discrepancy, but understand that Project Grudge was the official name of the military's investigation into UFOs from February 1949 until December 1951. Project Blue Book ran from 1952 until its termination in 1969. So, with this incident occurring in 1956, 4 years after the switch to Blue Book, why it was filed under Project Grudge Report 13 is a bit odd. But this Report 13 was apparently seen and read by former Green Beret Captain William English. He says he was asked to analyze the document while assigned to a U.S. security service at a former Royal Air Force base in England. English dictated 2 audio cassettes with details of what he remembered reading from Report 13. Also, in the early 70s, William Cooper says he too was given the chance to analyze an annotated version of Grudge Report 13. Adding to conspiracy theories about this incident, apparently Grudge Reports 1 through 12 and number 14 have all been declassified, but the alleged 600-page investigative Grudge Report 13 remains secreted away. Now, the government has denied the existence of Report 13, and there obviously isn't any official information available. The details of this incident come from English's cassettes and a radio interview he did in the 90s, and from Cooper, who both say they have seen and analyzed the report. Their stories are nearly similar in detail. Heck, maybe we should take the military at its word and conclude that the Project Grudge folks were simply superstitious and skipped from 12 to 14, just like some hotels do with the 13th floor. So we are left with a lot of questions, and left wondering if this event even happened. It would be easy to disregard it as complete fiction. Researchers have looked for records on Lovett at Holloman Air Force Base around the time he was there in March 1956. No records could be found. Did he even exist? Or were his records struck completely to cover up the alien abduction and mutilation because they simply could? I suppose if your intended mission was to alleviate public anxiety over UFOs and persuade the public that UFOs constituted nothing unusual or extraordinary, as was the stated aim of Project Grudge, then a story about alien abduction and human mutilation may run counter to that directive. But if it did happen, as English and Cooper said, it wouldn't be the lone case of alien abduction and human mutilation to be researched. In 1988, a Brazilian man's body was found in the Guaraparanga Reservoir in Sao Paulo, Brazil. The body had been mutilated in a very similar way as Lovett's. Parts removed with surgical precision, completely drained of blood, and despite being dead for 2 or 3 days, no sign of decomposition. Yet the victim could not even be identified. There have been numerous reports of livestock mutilation over a number of decades. Cattle, sheep, horses, deer, elk, and even rabbits discovered lifeless, bloodless, and some with parts surgically extracted or removed. On October 18, 2019, National Public Radio did a report on a discovery of the deflated, bloodless bodies of purebred bulls on Sylvie's Valley Ranch in eastern Oregon. And that lets us know that these kind of events are still taking place without any real explanation. In that story, rancher Colby Marshall talked about the eerie scene of the dead bulls. He described the corpse as looking like a giant, deflated plush toy. And there was a weird smell, not exactly of death, but something else. And yet, no buzzards, coyotes, or other scavenging animals had approached. The bull's red coat was still shiny, but its tongue and genitals had been removed with something very sharp. Even odder, not a drop of blood anywhere. In a different part of Oregon, near New Princeton, another report from ranchers there had similar details. Dead cattle, deflated and bloodless bodies. Andy Davies described the scene as surreal, especially with the lack of any blood anywhere and the fact that there were no tracks. She was quoted as saying, "In this dusty country, everything you do leaves tracks." Harney County Sheriff's Deputy Dan Jenkins was quoted in that story, saying he'd gotten a lot of tips about what happened to those animals. A lot of people leaned toward the aliens. One caller had told us to look for basically a depression under the carcass because he said that the alien ships will kind of beam the cow up and do whatever they're going to do with it. Then they just drop them from a great height. And what's more, there aren't any really credible leads other than what isn't causing these animal deaths. Jenkins said, "It isn't bears, wolves, cougars, or poisonous plants, nor were the animals shot." Another report from U.S. News and World Report from April 2021 about more strange cattle mutilations in Oregon. The descriptions and scenes are very similar to the ones from the 2019 NPR report. These types of reports have been coming in for a while from many different places around the United States, dating back to the late 1960s in Pueblo, Colorado, when a horse named Lady was found dead and mutilated, drained of blood, with alien abduction and medical experimentation as the leading explanation, since really no other plausible explanations can be understood. So did Jonathan Lovett get scooped up by an alien craft in 1956, his body mutilated and dumped in the New Mexico desert by an alien race interested in us humans? Or was the story completely fabricated? This story does predate other similar stories of the livestock mutilation by several years, leading at least to some credence to the story. It's not a copycat story, let's say. But maybe the aliens visiting our planet learned something from that incident in 1956. Outside of the 1956 New Mexico incident and the 1988 Brazil incident, no other alien abduction, human mutilation cases are out there. Maybe the knowledge they sought can be found with a probe and careful examination. So let's take the story of 71-year-old Jan Wolski. In the early morning hours of Wednesday, May 10, 1978, in Emilcin, Poland, Jan was driving his horse cart. By the way, not a euphemism for a car. He was actually perched on top of a wagon, being pulled by an actual horse. Anyway, he was riding along a dirt path when two strange-looking, short, green-faced humanoid creatures stopped his cart and climbed aboard on either side of him. They were dressed in black uniforms. Now, Jan may not have been the most worldly of people. His first thought was these were out-of-towners or foreigners. Well, I suppose when you think about it, he wasn't wrong exactly. He noticed their slanted eyes and high cheekbones and their short stature, guessing they were about 5 feet tall. The creatures spoke in a language he didn't understand, but they directed him further along to a clearing with hand gestures. There, Jan recalls an extremely white craft, about 16 feet tall and as long as a bus, hovering above the ground. He could hear a low hum emanating from the craft. An elevator-like platform was lowered, and Jan was put on it and brought aboard the ship. Another pair of these same entities were on board. One gestured for him to get undressed. He complied, and Jan recalls one of the aliens holding up 2 plate or saucer-like devices, which he assumed were scanning his body. While the scanning was taking place, Jan had full lucidity. He did not notice any windows or lights. The only light was from the daylight coming in the open hatch. He also noticed there were several birds near the entrance of the craft. He described them as rooks, which is a bird similar to a crow. He noticed their legs moving and they flapped their wings a little, but he felt like the birds were otherwise immobilized. After the short examination, he was allowed to redress, and the aliens offered him something to eat. Jan described what the aliens were offering, looking like an icicle, but he refused. He was escorted off the craft and allowed to continue on with his day. Now, Jan got back to his wagon, traveled home as fast as his one horse could pull. And when he arrived, he told his family what he had just experienced and encouraged them to grab some neighbors and come back with him to the spot where it had taken place. By the time they all returned to the spot Jan pointed out to them, the craft was gone. But his family and neighbors investigated the area and noted the grass where Jan said the craft had been as being trodden down, covered with dew and paths coming in all directions. His sons noticed alien footprints in the area. A village boy named Popiolik substantiated part of Jan's claim, saying he witnessed a bus-like craft hovering above a barn not far from the abduction site. He then said it climbed high in the sky and then vanished. Others also say they saw a craft similar to what Jan and the boy described, but they did not wish to recount their stories to anybody out of fear. Jan recounted his story to 2 journalists a few months later, which is where the information for this encounter is taken. Jan Wolski passed away in January 1990, but his story will forever be remembered, at least as far as the people of Emilcin are concerned. In 2005, a monument was erected by the Nautilus Foundation, a Polish organization that investigates UFOs. The stone monument, with a plaque and a silver cube attached at the top, sits proudly in Emilcin, Poland, commemorating the day that aliens came. The plaque script is written in Polish, but translated reads, "On the 10th of May, 1978 in Emilcin, a UFO object landed. The truth will astonish us in the future." This has been another strange but true stories. Time now to let us know what you think. Leave a comment below about today's stories. And if you have a story of an alien visitation, or perhaps a paranormal experience, or an unexplainable time glitch, and you'd like to share it with us, we would like to read it. Send your story along with as much detail as possible in an email to strangebutTrueStories2@gmail.com. As always, thanks for the support, and thanks for watching this video. I'm Steve White. Stay safe out there. Until next time.